that can attenuate me. I guess this is a hot spot here. Welcome to Denver Startup Week. So my name's Joey Spinella. This is my first DSW presentation. So thank you all for trusting me with some of your precious Monday afternoon. That's the Wi-Fi password if any of you were planning not to pay attention. Just a few things before we dive into the content. So Denver Startup Week is the largest free entrepreneurial event of its kind. So last year we had over 17,000 people. So it's neat that we can be part of this dynamic community. That's made possible by some of these sponsors. And special call out to Capital One for sponsoring the product management track. So this talk is part of the product track that we have this week. Thanks to the other sponsors. And just one thing to keep in mind with Denver Startup Week, let's also think about, this is a really awesome chance for us to come together as a community. And so I think, especially for me being a white male in a STEM field, I think it's easy for me to just feel comfortable, like a lot of doors are open to me, but it's really important to me, and I hope to all of us, that we can connect with people that look different with us so that we can increase diversity in our marketplaces, which is something that hopefully we all can drive as part of our time this week. Okay, so we have about 86 minutes. I am planning to use the whole time for this session, and we're going to do a few different things. But the topic we're going to try to cover has two parts. So the first part is how to delight your customers. And what we mean by that is, if you look at this, does anyone actually know where this is? Anyone recognize this place? Thailand, yeah? More specifically, anyone? Yeah, this is in Krabi Province. It's a beach called Raleigh Beach. Beautiful, pristine beach, right? And as we think about whatever our initiatives are that we're working on, our products or our businesses, this is the type of thing that we want to deliver to our customers, right? We want some kind of just pristine, beautiful, you want your product to look like this beach to your customers. And so in order for us to deliver that, we really need to understand, what does that beach look like to our customer? What does it mean? Do they want some big limestone rocks that they can go deep water soloing on? Do they want some nice sand? But I think what a lot of us end up doing if we're not careful, when we just get feedback from our different customers, is we end up with an offering that looks more like this. And so this is actually a picture from the same beach, Raleigh Beach in Thailand. And so we got this long-tail boat vendor, and I don't know his story. Maybe this is an optimal business model for him, but I can't help but think he got a lot of feedback along the way, right? Someone walked up and was like, hey, I'm a fat American tourist. I'd really like a burger. Can we do a burger instead of pad thai? So then we had the burger one, the pizza one. But from a product experience perspective, right? If our customer was going for this, but then we get enough feedback that we end up with this, no one's happy, right? And I don't think any of us would argue that this right here provokes a delighted reaction from anyone. Unless you've been looking everywhere for a burger and this is literally the only place on an island that sells a burger, then maybe you're pretty thrilled. Okay, so in terms of this topic, I really just have one thesis here, and this is that we can satisfy our customers by not just by following the whims of their feedback, but we actually need to pick a specific subsegment of customers, right? So a specific part of the market, a specific set of users, trying to accomplish a specific set of tasks. And if we focus like that, then we actually have a chance of really satisfying and delighting those users. Otherwise, we'll just end up with something that looked like that long-tail boat. And then the application of this is, as we're getting feedback, instead of us feeling like this is kind of a laundry list of things that we need to do, that means instead that this feedback can help us refine that understanding of what is this target market I'm going after. And it can help us align our execution of, okay, I'm getting this feedback and it looks like this should be the next piece that I try to accomplish to maximize the delight and the value that I'm delivering. So in order for us to accomplish, these abstract things, there's two tools I'm going to introduce today. These are two things that I've come up with as I've been working in product management for several years now. This first one is called a market frame. And so this market frame is going to help us map out what does that pristine, beautiful beach look like to our customers. And it's going to help us identify what is that first workflow we're going to try to focus on that's going to deliver value for our customers. the second piece is this feedback sorter. And what this feedback sorter is going to help us do is, once we've figured out what we're trying to get towards, it's going to help us keep our eye on that prize and allow us to discard feedback that maybe would pull us in unhelpful directions. So just to introduce myself, so I'm a senior product manager at Ping Identity. So Ping Identity is located here in like 17th and Arapahoe. And we're a company that makes single sign-on software. Or a really cool, really exciting week for Ping Identity if you follow us in the news, actually. And so for me, I've gotten the chance to work on 2 brand new 1.0 initiatives over the 5 or so years I've been doing product management. And along the way, I've gotten to learn a lot about what does it look like to try to focus that initiative on something we can actually deliver that results in value that makes for a successful product. And so I'm going to share some of the things I've learned, but I think there's also a lot of experience in this room. And so I'm really excited about a case study exercise that we're going to do. And so we're actually going to have a few parts of our time today where we're going to be splitting up into groups and working with the people around us to actually apply some of these concepts. So like that market frame and that feedback sorter. So be prepared. I hope you brought your extrovert today. Oh, and by the way, I have a prop here as well. So you can see my 90s mountain bike. And so the case study that we'll be using, we'll be trying to improve my ghetto commute to downtown Denver. Okay, so that was our introduction. Just to get to know the room a little bit here. I was talking to someone, they said they just moved to Denver. How many of you have lived in Denver for less than 1 year? Okay, keep your hands up. How many have lived in Denver for less than 2 years? Okay, so maybe not quite half. All right, maybe I was wrong. Denver, actually, more local than I thought, at least for Denver Startup Week. Okay, so first topic that we're gonna get into is just this, how to delight our customers. And really what this is gonna come down to is this concept of the market frame. And so this is a tool that I built with some of my colleagues at National Instruments. And you can see this example of like, commuting or that our case study is focused on. The idea with the market frame is it allows us to map all the way down to detailed requirements and then all the way up to the actual market segments that represent how much money we could make if we satisfied those requirements underneath, right? And so some important stuff in the middle is understanding who that persona is that we're serving, understanding the workflows of that persona that we actually want to tackle with our product. And so all of this is going to start from customer research. And so customer research, we could spend a whole day talking about this, but I think at a high level, it's really good to start with our customer research, just having a really specific goal of what we're trying to learn, trying to get a good sample size, trying to plan a program of visits where we're asking some of the same questions so that we can actually then, extrapolate and figure out, what direction we want to go with our product. And so what I found really helpful in those 2 1.0 initiatives I was talking to is starting actually with this workflow in the middle of my market map. And why do we start with the workflow? I think a lot of times we already have a specific idea in mind. So like Shay in the front row here, she was telling me about her butterfly earbuds that she's making as part of her company that just got some funding. And so, she's probably started with some kind of workflow of, okay, maybe there's people that are underserved today in the market by the earbud options that are available to them. And I have this idea of, maybe listening to music or maybe needing like assistance hearing someone if I'm hard of hearing. Those are some workflows I'm going to start with. And then I'm going to be able to move from there to understand who are some of the target personas that would make the most sense, certain age groups, people with certain special needs or disabilities. And then what are some of the requirements going to be? Charging time, how long it needs to run. From there, you can kind of flesh out understanding your market. And so, the idea with this one is, maybe if I started talking to people that were doing a summer commute on their bike, I would probably eventually learn about, what some of the requirements are. I'd start to learn about some of the adjacent workflows. I'd start to learn about who are these people, what market segment they're in. So kind of a eye chart here, but some of my favorite things to share with people about customer research is just, please do not pitch your idea. I have wasted so much time trying to ask leading questions, and it never gets me the answer I'm looking for, and it never gets people to actually buy into that idea. Instead, I'm just wasting time when I could learn about what actually does matter to them. I think another key idea that I'm going to illustrate with an example here is don't try to look for a problem to solve with some technology that you're working on. because that's also going to make it a lot more difficult for you to find what that pristine Raleigh beach looks like for your customer, because you'll be thinking about the jet ski that you want to drive on that beach, right? And maybe they don't want a jet ski on their beach. I don't. Okay, so I'm going to share a few examples. So this was an example from a previous company I worked for. And this was an example where we had this cool technology that let you remotely connect to this measurement software. So like you have some machine that's running and some sensors hooked up to it. You want to remotely connect to it and view over the web what's happening with your thing. So I'm going to share 5 examples of customers I spoke to on this research program, and then we're going to see what it looked like on the market map once I mapped it out. And disclaimer, it's not actually going to turn out very well for this one. So this is going to help me realize that this isn't a great idea. So customer number 1, super cool semiconductor lithography. So they have this stage that's actuated, that's controlled, and then they have this laser that's controlled by a separate system. They needed to coordinate those to work together. And so they were using some of our web communication technology to coordinate those two things. Okay, super techie guy. He made this custom piece of software to do this. And we also got lunch and talked about his wife's infertility problems. The second customer I spoke to, he was doing offshore wind turbines. He was kind of a biz dev guy, so more of like a marketing guy. And he had these controllers that were on these wind turbines, but he wanted to impress his investors. So he used our app and made this way that you could show like, hey, I can drill down into this turbine and see how it's doing and what its current power output is. He was never planning to use that for production. So that was customer number 2. And by the way, as I'm bringing these up, keep in mind, how would you map out the market segment, the persona, the workflow of what they're solving for here? Okay, then we can compare when I get to mine at the end. Customer number 3, growing organs in a chamber, okay? The robots want to build you a new heart, and we're gonna control this using my old company's products. Not creepy, it was to save lives. And the controller that was controlling this chamber was kind of a high performance thing that didn't just have a native user interface. So we needed to actually work around those limitations. So we built a custom way that he could remotely set the set points of what the pH of the fluid in our heart growing chamber would be, as well as the temperature. Okay, customer number 4. He was a product quality engineer. He had 15 different devices under test in a lab, and he wanted to see how they would break, okay? And so he was gonna run all of them through their paces like 1,000,000 times, and he just wanted one place that he could see how all 15 separate tests were running. Customer number 5, this was my favorite, because this one, I like got to the meeting and I was like, you know what? I think our technology would actually work for this guy. I think he's gonna love this. And I go down into this like dungeon of a lab. He has these big pipes that he's doing pressure tests. So he's like loading a bunch of pressure into the pipes and like, seeing how the performance of the valves are. But he didn't like hanging out in the dungeon. He wanted to go up to his office where the coffee was nearby and he had a more comfortable chair. And so I was like, this would be perfect. You could use our app, build a remote way to view it, and then you could check your thing and control it. And he said, yeah, that's great, but I just installed a free version of TeamViewer. And then I can just remote into my lab computer and I don't need to do any of that. And I was so disappointed. Okay, so those were the 5 customers. So if I went back and normally for a program of visits, your goal would be more like 8 to 10 different customers to get a better representation. If I were to map these out though, I end up with all these different silos, right? Everyone's in a different segment. Everyone's has a different persona. Everyone has pretty much a different workflow. There's some jobs that are maybe a little similar for those test engineers. But then when we even look at the acceptance criteria, it's so clear the things that are actually motivating these people to improve their day-to-day job are completely different. So one guy wants to get investment. One guy just wants to sit in his comfy chair, right? One person's trying to grow organs and that can be successfully implanted into animals for their pre-FDA approval tests. And so ultimately I decided, I came back to the team and I said, that's the last time I'm ever doing just take this technology and figure out how to fit it into the market, because that's a waste of time. Okay, so I'm also going to give another example from something that turned out a little more positively. So another project I worked on was, for the same company, this was software to help people design new like parts for cars. Okay, so you have like some like turbocharger in a car, and you do all these like temperature and pressure measurements to figure out like how it's working. And we wanted software that would make it really easy for you to just like run this test without having to write a custom program each time. And by the way, I'm giving these kind of hopefully like these super engineering technical stories, and I see some of you yawning. I do think that these principles of the market frame and the feedback sorter are pretty universally applicable. Okay, so whether it's a farmer's market, or a medical device, or earbuds, or enterprise software, I do think these concepts apply across the board. And I will be interested in hearing your feedback as we get to the Q&A, and from the times in your groups of how you do feel like this applies to your current working space. One thing also I forgot to mention, I do have a few product manager peers that are here with me today helping me out. So Matt, Laura, and Joe, as well as Greg in the back. And they helped me review this content. They're also going to be sharing some anecdotes from their experience as product managers when we get to the feedback sorter portion of the session. Okay, so for this project, it was a very different approach. Instead of this engineering team saying like, help me apply this technology, I actually had some execs in the business that said, hey, we've screwed this up like 4 times before. Like we made these products that just do not delight these customers. Can you go out and actually figure out how we can serve this area successfully? And we'll give you time to actually go and do that. And so this one did turn out really differently. And this was where it became clear to me, when you're working on an idea, when you're working on a workflow that actually resonates with the market, it actually is a real set of tasks that real users and real market segments care about, it is way easier for you to do your market research because people respond, people care, they're excited to get on the phone with you. So sometimes if you can't even set up the ability to research, that should be a great leading indicator of how easy it will be to sell. So in this case, I got to go all over the world, and I actually got to write over 500 pages of notes and pictures from labs. It's like you go into like Toyota Japan, and they're like all wearing the jumpsuits, and then you like ask like, hey, can I take a picture of this, like just for internal reference? And surprisingly, a lot of times they let you. So it's amazing what you can get away with, like for science as a product manager. Okay, so the next step is we're actually going to jump into our first part of the case study. But before I get into that, I want to open it up for questions. Any questions so far just about this market frame, customer research? Chad?
So my question is, where in the process is market size evaluation?
Good question. So I actually do have a slide that's going to talk about that a little bit later. How do we figure out, is this an attractive market segment that we actually want to go after? So I will get to that. Good question. Any other questions? Okay, so are you guys ready for the case study? Yeah, okay. So what I want you guys to do, look around you. I want you guys to turn your chairs and actually form groups of 4 to 5 people. And I know that may be a little awkward, but it's going to be great. So first task, form your little circles in your chairs, get to know each people's names, have one person in your group hold up their hand, and my lovely assistants are going to pass out a folder with a pen. Right? And so this case study, right, is you're trying to improve my summer downtown bike commute. Okay, so I live in Lakewood, I ride 6 miles in, that's my bike right there, okay? But the first thing we're going to talk about is you don't know if you really want to focus on it, right? First, you want to do some general market research. One way to think about this is, right, I'm telling you, like maybe I'm a VP coming and saying like, hey, build a product for this, but you guys need to just learn a lot about this space, right? So you can build your market frame. And so the first thing I want you to talk about is just jot down some ideas, share among your group. How would you try to conduct your customer research? How might you go about doing it? Who might you talk to? Where might you go? What kind of things might you do? And then what are some of the questions, if you were to interview someone like me that was in your target market, what are some of the questions you would want to ask them? Okay? So just take a few minutes and in your groups, try to tackle those.
Our group came up with maybe hanging out at bike paths that come in and out of the downtown area so we can see if people were having problems losing things or having to make repairs to the bikes that will give us some help on what they might need to have with them when they're on a bike. Another one was talking to bike shops and talking to the bike shop owners about people that come in buy different things for their bikes and what those things are and would it apply to being a commuter in and out of downtown with bike.
Great, that's awesome. Anyone else want to share some ideas they came up with?
Why do you ride a bike?
Are you asking me or is this a good question? That's a good question. I ride a bike because I love riding my bike. Why? Because it feels really good when I'm riding my handlebars.
It's not eco, it's not finance, it's just.
If I'm being honest, no.
What do you like about it?
What do I like about it? I like that it allows me to burn off some steam before I get to the office. I don't have to be quite as randy in some of my first meetings. I bring my bike. Good. I like that line of questioning. Good. Okay. Good job. You guys made it successfully through the first case study. You met some strangers. So there's going to be 2 more sections like this. Okay. So feel free, if you want to turn your chairs a little bit, you can, or just stay where you are. But I'm going to march through a little bit more. Shortly, though, we'll be getting back to another case study piece. Okay. So I think this stuff you guys came up with was super. So these were some of the ones I came up with. I think probably you guys came up with really similar ideas. So just in the spirit of, what was your name?
Jeff.
In the spirit of Jeff's questions, I'm actually going to share with you a little bit about my commute. So we're going to do an accelerated version of Joey's bike ride to downtown. So I start off in my neighborhood. I have to very quickly go around this little dirt part where this is like the most technical part of my ride. I drop off a curb. I have to hop up on another curb, go under this underpass. Sometimes there's homeless people and dirt under there. Go through some other neighborhoods, go by a golf course. That turn is kind of tricky. By the way, taking these pictures while I was riding was also kind of tricky. Oh, that's not very easy to see. So anyway, I have to squeeze by this construction. This is the part where I really ride no handlebars. There's some stop signs. I cut through MSU campus. Sometimes I hit I stop for trains. I don't hit them. Those carts are really annoying on the MSU campus. Then I make it to downtown. Then I have to carry my bike up some stairs in my building and hang it in a bike barn. Okay, so some of the problems, if you were to ask me, by the way, this whole premise is just like a really elaborate scheme to convince my wife to let me buy a nicer commuter bike. So she acknowledged this as I was running through this with her last night. But yeah, so sometimes when I pedal really hard, the back wheel pops out on my bike there. And also the second gear of the drivetrain is like totally shot. So it's really embarrassing when I like stand up and like the chain skips every single time. Okay, so what maybe happened after we did that research, right? We started off just with this one, green part. And now we're starting to map out like, okay, maybe there's some other, personas that we would run into, some different market segments. Like, there's those guys on those, like, it's always guys right now, at least that I've seen, is those little one wheel things that are kind of like cool segways, and then they have to like carry it around. It's also a workout because they look super heavy. So we start to get familiar with some of these different workflows. And then I think this is a good opportunity because we started with a workflow is for us to revisit, okay, who really is this persona and market segment that we actually want to focus on? Because maybe we had this initial theory, but maybe we actually bumped into something that was more attractive. And so just going back to that data logging example, so trying to help car companies design better turbochargers. These were all personas we had internally at my old company, and I changed the persona names for their anonymity. Okay, so you won't recognize them, but we decided, okay, we want to focus on Terry, who's this technician, right? We had a researcher, an engineer, kind of a lab manager. We realized, hey, this technician is really the person that doesn't want to have to write a program every time he or she has to test another turbocharger, okay? And so then once we had figured that out, we were able to kind of map out like, hey, you know what? This is kind of what Terry's primary workflow looks like, some goals. And one tool that was really helpful is after we made this slide, so at first I made this slide internally with a bunch of pictures I'd taken of real customers. Then I wanted to show it to customers. And so I then went and found like Googled images that looked like the images of the customers I'd taken. So these are all just kind of random Google images. But this was a really powerful tool for me to actually show my customers when I'd be kind of doing an interview with them or trying to set up something. I would just send them the slide and say like, hey, this is who we're trying to serve and what they're trying to do. And it was amazing how well it resonated, right? When it actually is a real persona, real workflow, you will know very quickly, and they're like, oh yeah, you need to talk to this guy. This is exactly what we're talking about. You know, or very quickly they'll say, nope, that's not what we're doing. But it also helps internally just to have that alignment on a persona slide. So this second part, I'm actually just going to talk through this one for time purposes. You know, so once we've done that research, probably the next thing you'd want to do is identify who is the target persona we really want to focus on here. You know, maybe list out the different people we encountered, but then who is it we want to prioritize? What market segment are they part of? And so these were some of the ones I came up with. You know, and maybe you list out in some more detail for some of them, but just for the exercise we're doing today, we're going to focus on this tech office worker. You know, and maybe there's some reasons for that, you know, just because they have, you know, more money to waste, or because they, it's, you know, it's a little easier to try to sell to them, like with something super techy. They'll be a sucker for something with a battery in it. I don't know. But let's focus on that tech office worker as our persona for this summer downtown Denver commute. Okay, so now we have a couple boxes on our market frame and we can start to flesh out a little more as we move forward. And so once we choose that persona, it's a good opportunity to actually revisit, well, did I start with the right workflow? Because maybe we said, hey, we want to start with the summer commute, but actually it'd be easier if we started with the weekend going to a festival or weekend kind of errand that they're running. And so in this example, for Terry the technician, there were all sorts of different automotive related tests they would do. Some of them would be kind of ad hoc tests. Some would be, I want to put a part in a temperature chamber. Some would be, I want to run a part until it breaks. Some would be, I'm going to drive around a vehicle with that part in it and see how it works in real life. And so it's a good chance to revisit those adjacent workflows and then actually flesh them out. And so what I love to do is get with a bunch of subject matter experts. So, you know, hopefully you can find these internal to your company, but you know, maybe they're in the sales organization, maybe they're in support, maybe they're development, maybe they're, you know, in UX or product management, but actually sit down in a room, do a post-it note exercise and say, hey, what's everything we know about this persona and what their workflow looks like as they're doing this? And try to flesh that out for, you know, the top 3 or 4 different workflows you think that persona would need to do. And then from there, we can refine them into, like, how many of you guys are familiar with the term jobs to be done? Okay, so yeah, job, you know, then we can map out these really detailed requirements of, you know, their jobs, their outcomes and constraints, and don't really have time to get into those topics today. But really useful tools to think about why someone actually is going to use your product. And just a plug, you know, for this resource, we won't get into it, but once you do actually map out, you know, all those really detailed requirements for that persona, then you can actually identify, you can keep track of how important are these requirements and how satisfied are they with their current solution, right? So if you were to ask me, I'm very dissatisfied that sometimes my back wheel pops out when I'm trying to pedal really hard from stop at a traffic light. So that's like a very underserved area, but I'm kind of overserved by my tires, right? I have these big mountain bike tires. For most of my ride, I'm riding on sidewalk and I actually don't need tires that thick. And so those are areas that are opportunities for differentiation from my current solution. Okay, so we're gonna do some case study time again. So part 3 of the case study is, you know, so you've done this research, you've identified, okay, this tech downtown commuter is the persona we're focusing on. I want you guys to get in your groups again and make a list of what are some of the steps that you think a tech downtown commuter would need to go through as part of their morning commute. And maybe what are some outcomes that they would want to optimize, maybe what are some constraints that they might face. Okay, so take a few minutes and do that in your groups. If you have any questions, raise your hand and we'll come around and help you guys. So these are some that I sketched out. You know, one thing I do want to mention, so I think most people understand jobs, and you guys we'll be talking for a while if you guys want to reset where you're sitting, but the outcomes are ones that have like maximize or minimize statements. And so I want to maximize my speed getting to work while minimizing my sweatiness. Because sometimes even like my 30-second cold shower isn't enough to kind of cool my body. And a constraint, right, is that my bike route is 70% sidewalk, about 15% street bike path, and 1% that one little dirt patch. So yeah, you guys did great. So once we've mapped all these out, right, then we can identify, hey, are there any of these that we can identify that we think for our offering, if we were to focus on, we could make a compelling solution, because this is something that's underserved, or this is a job or outcome that is overserved, and maybe we could do something that's cheaper that still is good enough to get the job done. Okay. So the outcome of all this, right, is that we can actually choose, hey, this is where we're going to focus on, and we're going to build this roadmap where we can then say, hey, we've done this research, we've chosen who our personas are, we've identified the segment that they're in, and now we actually have a list of workflows. For each of those workflows, we have a really detailed list of what are all the requirements that we need to solve, and even an understanding of how does that persona measure if this requirement is met. And so now, you know, if you go back to your people that are funding you, and you say, hey, I want to focus on this workflow, you actually can tell them this is about how much work it's going to take, because we need to check all these boxes, and this is how big the market opportunity is for that persona in that segment, right? We can actually do market analysis to determine how big of an opportunity that is. And so, you know, one thing, because Chad asked that question, I realized there was a slide that I must have hidden that talked about where, which one is an attractive segment we want to go after. So from that book, What Customers Want, one of the really key concepts that I thought they represented really well, I must have deleted the slide, is this idea of what makes an attractive market segment. And so this, you do have to keep in mind, checking along the way, hey, what does make this attractive is it needs to be something that is big enough, right? It can't just be like some tiny market that only has like 2 people in it, or else you're not going to be successful. It needs to be something that is that's right. Like there actually are areas of underserved or overserved jobs to be done. Because it could be like if everything is already like, I think bikes are a great example. There's been a ton of optimization in that market, right? You're not going to walk in and be like, wow, no one thought to put skinnier tires on a bike and it can go faster. And so you need an area that's right. You also need an area that fits strategically with your firm, right? So whatever you're doing, does it actually, this workflow, the way it needs to be served, is that something that you can solve, right? So if you're a company that makes bike locks, but everyone's already totally satisfied with their bike locks, or they never lock their bikes because they have a bike bar and they can put it in, that might not be an area that is actually an attractive strategic target for you to invest more in. And then a final important one that I think a lot of people forget about is, can I actually reach these customers with my sales and marketing efforts? Because even if you have all that differentiation, it's a big market, it's right, it also needs to be homogenous, by the way. There needs to be a consistent set of needs that you can actually serve. Because if everyone's different, those are actually different market segments. But even if you do all that, can you sell to those people? Can you find them? Can you contact them? Would they actually buy from you? Do you have a Salesforce model that maps to their needs? So that's my answer to that question. So just some roadmap advice as you are going through, you know, trying to, so we've done all this research, we've made this market frame. You know, my last advice on this topic of how to delight your customers is just, you know, focus on one workflow at a time. Because I've worked on so many initiatives where you look at your roadmap and then we actually put this market frame perspective on, you realize I'm trying to nibble away at like 5 different workflows all at the same time. And I don't actually have line of sight to serve and delight any of those. But if I can just take one workflow and go all in on that and actually deliver that, I can actually release an MVP product for that workflow. Those people will start wanting to use it, and then I can start to move to a next workflow. And so thinking of those workflows like individual dominoes we want to knock down, instead of this big amorphous market space where every time your sales team brings you feedback, you have to add that to your backlog, regardless of what market segment they're in or what persona or what workflow they're working on. So that was one of the big aha moments for me. I hope that's helpful for you guys. Sometimes you do have to spike a workflow, though. You know, sometimes you have to pretend to solve a workflow just to learn about what the requirements actually are in that space. Okay, so that really wraps up this first half of the section, which is good because we're about halfway through our time together today. Any questions, reactions to this topic so far? Great.
Yeah, Joe, in the previous slide there, you had ROI up there. So obviously this could be an iterative process where you've got alignment to what your company's trying to accomplish strategically and so on. You may pick a persona in a workflow, come out and realize that ROI really doesn't justify it. You probably iterate, go back and try and see if you can find something else, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and if you can do that without wasting any of your precious developer time, you are a product manager hero. Yeah, any other comments, questions?
What is similar in iteration is the second to last bullet, don't waste time on partial workflow solutions. How do you balance that with the value of iteration, right? Yeah, something out there learning quickly versus maybe going too deep.
Yeah. So I think one, that's definitely part of the juggling act, right? As a product manager, and that art and that science of, okay, I want to be optimizing my learning while also maximizing the value I'm delivering. And I think the lean startup mentality of having learning goals more than kind of deliverable goals, especially really early on in the initiative, is really healthy. At a certain point, once you get to like a 1.0, 2.0, then you hopefully have kind of a run rate, a snowball of recurring customers. But then you want to keep those happy, but you also want to start to expand. And so you also don't want to just get stuck with that first workflow and just go deeper and deeper into that workflow, even though that's not actually the whole market you want to go after. Because then your upside is limited. Yeah, good question. Any other comments? So this market concept, does anyone feel like they kind of already have like kind of a mentality like this when they're trying to approach a strategy, like map things out? Anyone feel like this is kind of a new concept for them? Cool. I know the rest of your quotes and your arms are. Okay, so let's get to, I think, the good part. All right, so we have this idea of the beach. We know what the beach looks like, right? We know there's no jet skis on the beach, right? But maybe there's starfish, right? Because you have kids and your kids are going to want to look at the starfish, right? So we know exactly what this looks like. Now, how do we make sure we don't, when we actually go to execute, we don't end up like this? Okay, and really this question is, if we go back to that application of this concept, for feedback, right, I thought I had another slide in here. Oh, well, so that feedback concept was, feedback doesn't tell us what to do, but it just helps us refine our market understanding and our execution toward that, right? So we want to get as much feedback as we can, but not as our laundry list of like, you got to do this. It's not chores, right? It's just helping us improve our understanding so then us as product managers can make the right execution decisions. And so in terms of feedback, I hope no one takes away from our conversation today like, well, how do you delight your customers without doing what they say? That just means you ignore their feedback, right? And you're the Steve Jobs, like guru, and you know it so well, and you have the vision, and like, you just are too small-minded, get out of my box, like I'm gonna change the world, through a better 90s mountain bike. So we want as much feedback as we can. And I think these are a lot of good ways to get it. Particularly, I've really enjoyed dabbling a bit with Google Design Sprints. So you can read about that if you just search Google Design Sprints. They have some resources on how to do that. But we want to get as much feedback as we can. We want to find good sources of feedback and then really lean in and get more feedback from those sources, okay? But what that means is it's going to feel like there's a ton of noise coming at us, right? So get a ton of feedback, but now let's figure out how do we keep our eye on that prize while we're getting that feedback. And so to help us do this, what we're looking for, right, is this just right feedback, right? It's from the right persona who's in the right segment, who's completing the right workflow, right? And also that we have a representative sample size on it, right? So even if that person is right, but you just have one of them, you want to see, is this something that consistently is coming up when I do a usability test across multiple customers? Okay, that's a good indicator that this is really some feedback I want to lean in on. And so this can help us refine our understanding as well as align our execution to really maximize the value we're delivering to the market. But I would say maybe half the feedback you get isn't like this. And so this tool that I've introduced here is the feedback sorter. And the feedback sorter is going to help us identify some of the common feedback traps of tainted feedback that would come in that, maybe we want to take that feedback with a grain of salt. Maybe we want to put that feedback deep on our roadmap, or maybe we literally don't even want to write that down just because we already know it's not valid. And we even want to follow up with our developer that was on the call afterward and be like, hey, just so you know, that really wasn't good feedback. Don't even absorb that into your psyche. And so these are the categories I came up with. These aren't perfect. Maybe you can think of more. Maybe some of these blur together. But so these first two, too close, too far, those have to do with your execution, where you are in your initiative. And then these other four, too niche, wrong persona, wrong model, wrong tool, these are things that because of the way they're coming in toward you, they may not really help you refine that market understanding. So you may want to take them with a grain of salt. So we're going to walk through each of these one by one. So first, let's talk about too close. So too close could be prescriptive feedback. It could be feedback that's just like a reaction to like some hiccups they saw in a demo, and they're like, oh, that looked weird. Like, what was that? And kind of like rabbit trailing down that. Maybe pandering to personal bias, like, hey, I love the color purple. Like, can you make it purple? And it may be things that also, if you honestly let that user just keep using your product for a little longer, they may completely forget about what that feedback even was. Keep in mind though, if your too close feedback is so frustrating to users that they can't even engage with your product, you better take note of that, because you do need people to actually engage with wherever you're at to help you improve. So sometimes you do have to do throwaway work or things that, just allow you to get that next level of feedback. So an example of too close feedback, Oliver is going to recognize this. So we're working on a product at Ping Identity called Ping Central. It's in beta right now. And as we rolled out this beta to customers, some of them gave the feedback, there's this place in the product where there's kind of a demo mode that you can set up users, and you actually assign a password to them, okay? So in general, you don't want to assign passwords to users much less manually, but this was just so we could get through the demo and kind of show there's these different types of roles. And so some people that were using this, they said, hey, that's really annoying. I typed in, a 4-character password, and then after I hit save, I type it twice, hit save, then you tell me the requirements for that password. That's super annoying. Can you change that so I know up front? And this is an example, I think, of too close feedback, because that's something that we're going to totally replace in our 1.0 release that we're releasing in a couple weeks. Okay, so that experience won't even be valid anymore. So even though that's true, that's frustrating, I'm not going to prioritize that over things that will deliver more long-term value. Okay, so that's an example of too close feedback. But we also have too far feedback. Okay, so the too far feedback is going to be when it's so far from where you are that it's not really appropriate for you to dive into that or act on that yet. Okay, so an example of too far feedback might be something that's from your development team. They might say like, oh my gosh, we need to architect this thing. Like, we need to make this highly available. We need to make this so this can scale up to millions of users. And even though, in my deep product manager heart, like, I aspire to serve millions of users, I also know that serving millions of users isn't my problem right now. Serving 10 users is my problem. And unless I can figure out how to adequately serve those 10 users, it's really not, it's not going to help me achieve those learning goals, like that lean mentality, by trying to architect up or, build a partner integration. So I think those what if questions are things that might be a little too far. I'm not saying you never invest in architecture, right? That stuff is really important. But in terms of, just aligning with where you are in your execution, you always just want to be a little bit ahead of where the customer implementation is so that you can maximize the amount of resources that, the amount of value you're delivering for the resources you're investing. One thing to keep in mind though is too far feedback is often super valid, right? So when they say like, hey, we need to make this scale to these users, I'm gonna write that down like in our tech debt backlog far down the list. Okay, so it's gonna be there. I'm gonna capture that. I don't want to forget about it because it often is super valid, and before you know it, right, you may be coming back and realizing actually this is bubbling up. So still worth capturing, but probably not worth acting on immediately. Okay, so an example of too far feedback. Okay, so we had this alpha version of this Ping Central product we were working on. I showed it to some of our internal sales engineers, and they said, hey, it's so great that you support A, B, and C. You also need to support D, E, and F. And then another sales engineer said, hey, you know what? I don't know about D and F, but you definitely need to do G, H, and I. And I was just like, whoa, we only have just barely cracked ABC. All right, I'm gonna write this down because I'm sure you're right. Like, I just don't even know enough about the product yet to know that, but I'm just gonna write it down. And lo and behold, when it came down to the beta, suddenly I had all these customers saying like, hey, A, B, and C is great, but what about G? I really need G. And then I was really glad I had actually understood what the sales guy had said, because I would have had no idea what they're talking about with G, but now I realize like, okay, yeah, G, we have G on our backlog. G's an old friend. Yeah, that's coming soon. You know, like, we're gonna bump that up for you, right? And so even though it's too far, I realized, you know what, actually maybe this one piece of it isn't actually too far. Maybe this one piece is actually just right. And so you still wanna write it down, but you also really do wanna be aligned with, like, I don't have time right now to do D, E, and F, and H, and I. But G, yeah, I'm gonna consider that one. Okay, so that's too far. So we have 4 more to go here. Then we're gonna go back to our case study. So too niche, okay? So this doesn't mean too niche, even though there's kind of a resemblance there. And Nietzsche did say, you know, that which does not kill your product will only make it stronger, which can be true of feedback, unless you fall into these feedback traps, and then it will kill your product. So let's follow Nietzsche's advice and avoid feedback that's too niche, okay? So that might be feedback that's really specific to one customer's way of doing things. Like I need a naming convention, right? I need to integrate with this. This breaks my workflow unless you do this really specific thing. And so we want to be really careful that we're focused on serving a broad market set. Although one thing to keep in mind is if you're getting all sorts of niche feedback, it could be that having a long tail strategy where there's extensibility or customization in your product so that, you know, kind of anyone can bring their own custom piece that solves exactly what they need. That might be a good way for you to be differentiated and actually serve those needs. Like bring your own kind of last mile integration on top of this more flexible platform we have. Okay, so now I'm gonna have Joe. Joe's gonna share with us an example that he's seen.
Yeah, so we were building a product for a partnership that we had with another company. So B2B business, we partner with other B2Bs to our clients so that we can provide integrated solutions, right? One of those was with a background check screening company. So we had to define what would this product look like. And so I'm out doing interviews and I'm talking with our clients and validating the workflows, right? Getting an idea of those workflows. And one of the clients came and said, well, you know, tell me how you're going to store and handle our sensitive social security information, because that's part of our work process with background check company, right? So the question comes in, you know, how do I receive that? How do I handle that? One of the things that I would say is part of this whole niche, you know, getting around this niche. If I hadn't had any other validating interviews prior to, I wouldn't know whether that was something that I had to kind of put aside or not. But there's a benefit to having, you know, a number of interviews, like we talked about, you know, knowing not just one customer, but understanding a broader workflow, but then I'm all kind of taking into account. So I don't want to throw it out because that customer is very sincere. That's part of their workflow, right? For me to come in and say, hey, sorry, you don't need that, right? I don't know their lives. I don't know their workflows. So there was a sensitivity that I had to that, even though I knew that the integration from other clients and customers and their workflows and what their functionality can handle is that there's a workflow around having to have social security numbers even in the product itself, because the background check vendor is going to actually go out and get that from the contractor themselves. So I don't need to pass it, right? So I could have said that on the call and, you know, got into a confrontation with that client. Instead, my response was, you know, let's just look at this again. You know, let's integrate it with the vendor. Could actually give us some more flexibility that you're not used to. Why don't we get a call with them, you, me, let's just talk about your workflow together, right? And so it was something where I was able to leverage the relationship and validation that I already had with that partnership with that client to help guide them along to a different mental model of how their process should work to how it could work. And that's how I was able to use that, remove that, kind of get them out of that whole niche mindset that has to be this way, because that's how they've done it for 15 years, right? So that's good.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. Okay, we're gonna get some examples from some of the other product managers here too. So wrong persona. So wrong persona, I like to summarize this one. She doesn't even go here. This is from one of my favorite movies. And it's really what it feels like, right? Like you're on a call with someone and they're giving you feedback and you're like, wait a second, like you wouldn't even use this. This isn't even your thing. Like, why do you just like to talk? Like, do you have to have an opinion? And sometimes it's a little more, it's a little harder to suss out, because like maybe they used to do that job, but now they don't. And so they have opinions, but then you realize like, wait, no, you just wanted to give input here, but you're not actually feeling that pain anymore. So since you're a little more removed from that pain, I'm going to be a little more removed from your feedback. And so I think another key thing to keep in mind here is, especially if this persona is coming maybe from a different market segment, right? And so they're like, hey, this isn't exactly the same, but there's just this one part that's different, right? And I think I always get the heebie-jeebies when I hear that, just because I don't know that that's the only thing, right? And a lot of times when we really dig into it and understand that whole other segment, we realize there's actually several other features. And maybe there's a whole different competitor that's super vertically differentiated in their space, and it's not even worth me wasting my time there. So it's when someone tries to take you off your map, you just need to put them where they are on the map and make sure that you can refine their part of the map, but not let it pollute where you are. Another thing to keep in mind, though, is a lot of workflows do require the satisfaction of multiple personas, right? So as part of my commute to work, I have coworker personas I need to satisfy. You can think, so I sit next to Katie, and you can think how she might have things that she would want to make sure happen after I get all sweaty biking to work, like showering, changing, right? And then there's also like my wife at home. She's also an important stakeholder, right? And so if me biking means I get home way later and then I also have to shower, like that's going to affect her thing, right? So she should spend more money to get me a nicer road bike. Oh, sorry. So at any rate, for wrong persona, Laura's going to share an example.
Yeah, so here's a more concrete example. We've been talking a lot about tech. Let's talk about beer. So I used to work at a brewery in town, Renegade Brewing Company. At one point, we were approached by this pub chain who wanted us to brew a house beer for them. So instead of calling it Renegade beer, we were going to call it, like pub chain house beer. So the owner is in conversation with us, and as we're talking, just make sure it's a good fit, he admits, he goes, I'm not a beer drinker. I go to a restaurant, I order wine, I order a cocktail. I just don't have a taste for beer. I don't have a palate for it. So we start working with his second in command, Johnny, who loves beer. So Johnny and I, we work together. We work on recipes. We brew some beers. We taste it, and we get to one of the tastings, and lo and behold, the owner shows up to this beer tasting. And he takes a sip of the beer and he goes, oh, I don't like it. It's like, of course you don't like that beer. We're not brewing this beer for you. You admitted that you don't go to bars and order beer. We're looking to make a beer for your customers that go to a bar and order a beer. So if you're drinking an IPA and your taste for, you don't like beer that's bitter or highly carbonated, you're not gonna like this. You're not our persona. And so it was a lot more about like, after that session, we kind of had to calm ourselves down because everybody got worked up. And I'm like, no, this is like our third try at this recipe, back to the drawing board. We have to do this all over again. It's like, no, guys, we're not going to make a beer that this guy likes. He doesn't like beer. Like, let's try to make something that the general guest at his bar will like, and not something that he's going to enjoy. So kind of taking that feedback, and at that point, he was a stakeholder. He was going to pay us to brew the beer for him, but to be perfectly honest, his opinion in beer just doesn't matter.
Love that. That's an example we can relate to. I hate IPAs, but sorry, now I just lost half the audience. All right, so let's talk about wrong tool. More of a Heffa guy, I know. Wrong tool. So sometimes, this one's kind of interesting because it feels like good feedback and you see like, hey, this is legitimately part of their workflow. But sometimes you realize, wait a second, like, you're talking about Excel. Like, everyone uses Excel. Like, I don't need to do Excel as well as this other thing, right? Or, you know, like some other example, like, use your smartphone. Like, I don't need to put a computer in your bike anymore because you can use Strava, right? Strava. Sorry, Strava. And so I think with the wrong tool, it's sometimes good to recognize like, okay, if this is actually a problem that could be better solved by something that's just an industry best practice or something that 90% of the market does, that can really lower the bar for what you need to do to solve that workflow. Just make sure that you can integrate well enough with that tool. Because, you know, maybe that customer that's saying, hey, you need to solve this too, they may just not be familiar enough with the market and not familiar enough with best practices. And, you know, if there's a huge chunk of the market that's like that, then great. You know, tread lightly though, because all it takes is like one conversation with their friend when they realize, oh, everyone uses this, and then they'll start using that. So, and if they're so bad at finding out about a real tool that does it, are they really gonna be that good at finding out about your product? One thing to keep in mind though is if as part of that workflow, there's a lot of different tools that need to be used and maybe they're all kind of industry standard. If you have a vertically focused experience that can actually solve all those problems. So like if I had a bike frame that integrated a lock into it, you know, that might be a vertical solution that would be really attractive to like those city bike rental things, right? Like a bike sharing program that you're like, hey, we want to do that, right? Or like I want to build a dock that locks the bike and detects if it was returned. Like that's a good vertical integration. So sometimes you can drive differentiation there. So for wrong tool, you know, I was joking about Excel, but for this workflow with this data logging software we're making, after every test, someone would want to go in and they would want to see like, hey, what was the maximum like acceleration forces that this device I was testing experienced? And so every time after they finish the test, they want to take the data, export it to CSV, load it up in Excel, select the right thing, put it on a, you know, insert a chart, then look at it, except Excel, it's really hard to see the value. So they double click on it, wait, format it so I can see the label. And now they can just see like, was the test successful or not? So even though that was a really common tool they were using, we found that we were able to actually drive more differentiation by just, and we actually already had a vertically focused product, but we bundled that with this data logging software so that you could just have one workflow where you could just drag and drop your test data, immediately see what the peak was and just hover over it without having to, you know, do that scrolly thing in Excel where you try to select but then go all the way down and have it scroll the right distance. Okay, last feedback trap, wrong model. So I think this one is one of another really tricky one, but it's important for us to keep in mind. So sometimes you'll be talking to a customer and you'll realize they're really caught up on a previous reference point. You know, maybe it's an old paradigm, like a different technology stack, or maybe it's just something like they had a homegrown solution that they got really used to, and so now they just expect the new thing to do everything their tool did except more. But what we really have to be careful with is if you're doing all these usability tests and every user has the wrong mental model, that could be a sign that you have the wrong model, right? So we want to figure out this mental model piece really early, ideally before we've even written code. So if you can like make a clickable prototype and do a usability test and figure out, does this design, does this model make sense for these customers? That's something you definitely want to do so that you don't have to pivot after you've already invested in building something. Okay, so Matt's going to share an example of this.
Hey guys, I'm Matt. I do like IPAs and good old fashioned. If anybody wants to get a drink. So wrong model. So this is unfortunately an example of my least favorite, but probably most used quote that people have all the time. It's the Henry Ford quote, which Henry Ford probably never actually said. Of, you know, if you ask people what they wanted, they would have said they wanted faster horses, not a car. They never would have thought that up because their reference point, they couldn't even imagine that as an option to solve a problem. Again, I don't think he really said that, but I think it's a great explanation of what this problem is. So I work for a company that builds backend software for building, designing, implementing, and managing digital signage. So that can be everything from airport information signs to hotel and restaurant kiosks to wayfinding stuff, maps that you might find in a shopping mall, to employee communications, all that sort of stuff. It had been built over the course of the last 15 years, really powerful tool, one of the best in the industry. It's a C# Windows-based application. It had a certain very antiquated tone to it, as most Windows-based applications do, but it could do a lot. Our job as product managers was to move that in more of a cloud-based approach, not just so that it could be more mobile, more usable, like people might not be running a Windows-based application or want to pay for licensing software, but also to potentially create a new workflow and new scenarios. So one example was, in the Windows scenario, you'd have all these folders as you organize everything. You right-click on the folder, you get a lot of different options, you go through and you set different variable values and associations with different data integrations and all this sort of stuff, and you get this nice little output. We build a web-based application. We build folders. It looks so nice. But the first piece of feedback we get is, I thought I could right-click on that folder and do this. When are you going to add that? I want all those exact same features. And as you guys know, ultimately what we really get judged on as product managers is shipping features. The problem is, what we really need to be good at is not shipping features, we need to be good at solving problems. And so I think one of the big frameworks we need to keep in mind with this feedback and this wrong model is really trying to understand what you're asking for. Why are you asking for that? What is it you want to do? What's the end result of what you want? And I think that in conjunction with good developers, good UX designers, being able to understand, do we need to right-click and create the exact same menu, the same workflow, or is there a different way to solve the same problem that potentially reduces clicks, is a more logical flow? While maybe different than what you thought it was going to be, it delivers on the same expectation at the end, and ultimately gives you potentially a framework to build more, which I would like to pat ourselves on the back and say we did that by implementing a different model. But again, I think it's being able to look at what's the problem they're trying to solve rather than what's the feature that they're asking for.
Yeah, great example, Matt. So those are our feedback traps. So last part of our case study, you guys are going to sort some feedback that you got from your customer, okay? This is the last part, then we'll wrap up, do some Q&A. So get in your teams again, and you got these 6 pieces of feedback, and there's not necessarily one right answer here, but maybe think through some of these, and do you think some of these are just right? Do you think some of these fall into some of these feedback traps? Work through those and talk amongst yourselves. Wrap up. Okay. So, please don't be frustrated with me. It's not necessarily down right here for a lot of these. Did anyone want to call out one that they feel like confident? This one is that type of that place on the feedback score. Anyone want to call out a specific one that like, hey, I'm confident this I would put that there on the feedback score.
But the one about the seat being too high seems pretty niche. It only helps tall people.
Okay. What was that a similar conclusion people made about the seating too high? What did you guys come up with?
So we came up with too close.
Too close.
It's just talking about that one individual and their mindset or their frame of reference, not knowing a way that can change this.
Yeah, and at least for the bikes that I bring, usually it's fairly easy to adjust the seat height. So it's like if that's your turn on, it's like, give me 30 seconds.
I can make it probably go away.
But if it was a massive frame, I think that would be maybe the seat's too high just because it's a massive frame. Good. Any other ones where you're like, hey, I think I might put this here.
And number 5 is just right.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes sense.
Okay, so number 5, I would like fenders. Yeah, that's what kind of commuter doesn't want fenders unless you live in a really dry place where it rarely rains.
You don't want that trail.
That's true. That's true. I didn't hear what Jeff said.
Can't they just go buy fenders?
They could buy fenders. So that's a good point. That could also just be like, that's a tool. Like go out and get that tool yourself. I don't need as a bike manufacturer, maybe I don't need to install fenders. Yeah, so a lot of these, there's different ways we could have sorted them. This was kind of how I sorted them. We could probably have a conversation where you could convince me why you put something in one place. This is not a quiz, not right or wrong, okay? So at any rate, so that was the content we wanted to cover. I hope that case study, these tools were helpful. So remember, at the end of the day, right, we want to know what that beach looks like. We want to make sure we don't end up executing like this. This thesis, right, is we can satisfy and delight our customers not by following the whims of their feedback, but by targeting our focus on a specific market segment, specific jobs to be done, specific user. And this feedback then that we get, this can help us actually just refine that market understanding and align our execution. So the tools we used were these two things. And that's the end of my content. So love to hear your feedback or any questions, comments you guys have. Any questions?
So in the use cases, we have the problems, which is the right. We have the problem. Yes, and we have the problem, which is commuting from specific place to downtown. But I think you said that we have to focus on the problem. Maybe the solution is not the bike.
Right. So sometimes you research something and realize for where your company is, right? Like let's say it's an e-bike company, but then you find out this segment doesn't care about e-bikes. I mean, ultimately you need to find what are the segments that and personas and workflows that actually are well solved by e-bikes. So maybe with your e-bike, you do your research and realize actually someone who's retired, who's not as strong as they used to be, and they have discretionary income, maybe that would be the segment you would actually focus on first. But then that would end up changing your workflow. So instead of me focusing on the commute, I'm going to focus on maybe a mountain bike, except you can't ride an e-bike on Jeffco trails, thanks be to God. So I think sometimes you do, when you do have a specific technology or specific niche that your firm is in, then you sometimes do have to actually pivot where you end up going.
I have a question. You have the job. What was the job?
The jobs to be done?
The jobs to be done.
Yeah.
Is it for one user or aggregate for all the feedback that I get?
Yeah, so the jobs to be done is something that you're trying to find. That's a great question. So it's not just going to be like for each user that you talk to, you make a list of their jobs, but you want it to be an aggregate that represents that persona for that market segment. So once you go out and talk to 20 different users, then I can actually map out, okay, this is the 95% confidence interval of the jobs to be done that's going to satisfy that set of users. Yeah, great. Any other questions? Yeah, in the back.
So you spoke about how you turn in the feedback sort of feedback was wrong in those many different dimensions. How do you turn the feedback just right?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So how do we know feedback is just right? So the just right feedback is going to be feedback that is for the right persona in the right segment, doing the right workflow, aligned with where you are in your execution, right? So if we're working on that bike service and someone says like, hey, like these bikes that, let's say it's a bike sharing program, these bikes would be a lot more compelling if you had fenders installed on them. It's like, oh wait, that's something we could retrofit. That would be a good next thing we could do to improve. And so that's what it's going to look like. And sometimes it's further down the road. Sometimes it's, there's a pretty big pocket of just right feedback. I don't want to make it sound like 90% of the feedback you get is bogus, because a lot of it's really good. It's just sometimes you can avoid those distractions by noticing some of those traps.
It strikes me that a lot of the categorization we're doing relies on intuition, right? So you're understanding the workflow, understanding the persona, and then using intuition to judge where it falls. Do you have any tips for, we've got a lot of product owners, junior product managers here. Do you have any tips for how you would, start to develop good intuition on that categorizing?
That's a great question. So, repeating for the group, how would you develop this intuition to do this learning? Let's face it, right? I'm 29. I've been doing this for 5 years. So like, I'm still figuring things out here. This is kind of what has started to make sense for me. But maybe like day one, if you showed me this, that I maybe wouldn't have even been able to absorb it until I had gone through a few reps. And so I think part of that is just acknowledging where we are on our journey. And I think the best way to build that intuition is just get more reps on projects. And as you're mentoring someone like that, exposing them to those concepts. I think when you are grown up in a framework like that, it maybe helps you learn a little quicker about how to do that.
On that topic, do you find yourself, so if you receive feedback from a client or a customer that was not your largest, would you then, when you were like kind of on the fence about where that may fall in the sorter, right? Would you add that almost as a question in your next meeting to then gauge like the response rate, if you will?
Oh yeah.
So then you're able to see like this large customer also is a 10 out of 10 on this big report.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think feedback, even if it's coming from an invalid source, like a sales engineer or something, that can be really great fodder for you to then refine your discussion guide for the next round of feedback you are getting from your real customers. And so sometimes just getting exposed to a topic is that key first step. Yeah.
One thing as well. I think one thing for sort of new product managers, just from a frame of reference standpoint, I mean, we kind of went through it quickly just for time today, but I think that really understanding your customer model, really understanding who that persona is, will really help you understand how to filter that feedback. I mean, we didn't really flesh out all the details, how that person really thinks, but the more you understand who that person is, you can almost think like that person when you go, does that matter? Is that really going to solve my problem? And then you can really filter based on that. So that piece, I think, more than anything, is a really critical filter for how you're going to interpret. And I think that's probably why some teams would bucket some of that feedback as wrong tool versus wrong model, because the way you interpreted that persona was different.
And I would encourage everybody to lean on the expert